Today, we are delving into a story from the late 19th century. So, sit back and travel with us to England. Frances Cole's life began on September 17, 1859, in the working-class neighborhood of Bury in South London. Born into a family of modest means, her upbringing was shaped by poverty. Her father, William James Coles, hailed from the village of Pablo in Somerset. He had moved to London in search of better work opportunities. He worked as a shoemaker, a trade that, while skilled, often offered only a meager income. Frances's mother, Marianne, came from the small town of Amarin in Ireland. Like many families in Victorian England, the Coles struggled to make ends meet. Frances grew up in a time when childhood for many working-class families was difficult. Access to education was limited, especially for children in poor families. Many schools were overcrowded, poorly funded, and lacked proper teaching materials. The curriculum was basic, focusing mostly on reading, writing, and arithmetic. For many, education was a luxury that could be put aside when there were bills to pay. Children were often pulled out of school to work, helping their families earn money. Teachers were underpaid, overworked, and often unqualified. Frances's early years were marked by a lack of stability and security. Her parents worked hard, but their economic situation was dire. They moved to White Lion Court in Bury, a district known for its busy leather industries. Despite their efforts to improve their circumstances, they continued to face poor housing conditions, sanitation problems, and the everyday challenges of working-class life in Victorian London. In 1880, at the age of 21, Frances left her family home. She found work as a saleswoman at a wholesale pharmacy in the Minories, a district on the northern side of the Thames. Despite the potential for steady work, the job took a toll on her health. The constant physical strain of uncorking and handling bottles left her hands sore and bruised. She confided in her older sister, Marianne, about her frustrations. Frances had hoped that the pharmacy work would offer her some stability, but the reality of the job soon became too much for her to bear. She was forced to give it up and seek a new path. But life did not improve for Frances. By 1883, at 24 years old, she found herself on the streets, forced to rely on a lifestyle she had never anticipated. Desperate to support herself, she turned to the only work available, prostitution. Though she had always been a beautiful woman and quickly gained attention from local men, this new life was harsh and demanding. But for a time, it seemed to be the only option that would allow her to survive. Despite the difficulties, Frances was determined to keep her family in the dark about her situation. She went to great lengths to hide the truth, particularly from her father. She kept up the illusion that she was living a respectable life and working as a saleswoman. In December of 1890, she visited her sister Marianne, telling her that she was staying with an elderly woman near Commercial Road and still working at the pharmacy. But her appearance gave her secret away. Frances looked unkempt, and there was an unmistakable smell of alcohol about her. Marianne began to worry and suspect that something was terribly wrong. In 1891, Frances's father, James Coles, had become frail and was living in the Bury workhouse on Tanner Street. Despite the hardships she faced in her own life, Frances made it a point to visit him regularly. She even attended church with him, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the strain of her life on the streets weighed heavily on her, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the facade of respectability. Although James was in poor health, he was not unaware of his daughter's condition. He had become increasingly concerned about her well-being and would often ask her how she was doing. Frances would reassure him, telling him that everything was fine and that he shouldn't worry. Yet, on Friday, February 6, 1891, she finally opened up to him. She confessed that she had left her job at the pharmacy, but she told him not to worry. She assured him that she was still doing well and was living near Commercial Road, though in truth, she was desperately attempting to disguise the grim reality of her life. On Wednesday, February 11, 1891, a 53-year-old merchant seaman named James Sadler was given some time off from his ship, the SSFZ. Eager to make the most of his leave, He visited a few alehouses before eventually making his way to the Princess Alice pub. Inside, he encountered Frances Coles, a woman he knew from previous encounters. James had once been one of her regular clients. After exchanging a few words, the two left together and made their way to Spitalfields Chambers, a popular lodging house located on Wits Row. There, they spent the night together. The following day, Frances and James stayed at the lodging house and continued drinking throughout the day. By the evening of February 12th, Frances visited a milliner's shop on Nottingham Street in Bethnal Green, where she bought a new black hat using money given to her by James Sadler. The shopkeeper, Peter Hawkes, noted that Frances appeared quite intoxicated, though he still sold her the hat. Roughly an hour later, at around 9 p.m., Frances and James were seen having a heated argument. James claimed that he had been robbed, but Frances, seemingly unconcerned, refused to give him any money. James, angered by her refusal, wandered off. By 11:30 p.m., Frances had returned to Spitalfields Chambers. She was visibly drunk and found a spot on a bench in the kitchen, resting her head on her arms as she quickly fell asleep. Not long after, James Sadler returned to the lodging house in a much worse state. He was battered and bruised, clearly upset. He had apparently been denied entry back onto his ship, the SSFZ, and had gotten involved in several drunken altercations. The night watchman, Charles Goh, seemed to take pity on James and, concerned for his condition, helped him clean the blood from his face. However, Goh would not allow James to go beyond the kitchen. When James saw Frances lying on the bench, he asked her if she had any money. Frances briefly looked up and muttered no before closing her eyes again. Frustrated, James accused her of spending the money he had given her on alcohol. With no money of his own, he was informed by the watchman that he could not stay the night without paying. Left with no other choice, James left the lodging house around 1 a.m. Frances, too, faced a similar predicament. With no money to pay for her bed, she had to leave the lodging house as well. It was a bitterly cold night, and with nowhere to go, she wandered the streets. She eventually made her way to Shuttleworth's Cafe on Wentworth Street, where she ordered some food. However, despite the warmth of the cafe, she had nowhere to stay. Joseph Haswell, a young man who worked at the cafe, eventually persuaded her to leave. As Frances walked the streets, she encountered another woman named Ellen Kalana, who also worked as a prostitute in the East End. They exchanged a few words, and as they spoke, a man wearing a cheese cutter hat approached them and attempted to solicit Ellen. When she refused, the man punched her in the face. He then turned his attention to Frances. Despite seeing how the man had treated her friend, Frances chose to engage with him. The two walked away together. At approximately 2:15 a.m. on Friday, February 13, 1891, Police Constable Ernest Thompson was on patrol near the Royal Mint when he discovered a young woman lying in Swallow Gardens. The woman had been violently attacked, and a deep cut ran across her throat. To his shock, PC Thompson found that she was still alive. He immediately blew his whistle, signaling for backup. Within minutes, Police Constable Cable Elliott, who had been patrolling the area nearby, arrived to assist. The two officers rushed to help the severely injured woman. PC Thompson informed the officers that he had passed through the area about 15 minutes earlier. Upon his return, he had heard footsteps fading into the distance. Intrigued, he looked into the dimly lit archway and discovered a figure lying motionless on the ground. Moments later, PCY Hyde arrived and immediately went to fetch a doctor. Though it felt like an eternity, Dr. Oxley arrived shortly thereafter and confirmed that the woman had already passed away. By now, word of the murder in Swallow Gardens had spread, and more officers, including Inspector Flanagan, arrived at the scene. The inspector quickly instructed his team to avoid disturbing the body until they could determine the facts. Within a short time, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, arrived to examine the victim. His findings indicated that the cause of death was a deep gash across her throat. The memory of the 1888 Jack the Ripper murders was still fresh in the minds of Londoners, particularly those in the East End. The brutal killings from just a few years prior had left the city shaken, and the similarities in this new crime quickly stirred unease. Speculation spread like wildfire, with newspapers fanning the flames of fear, suggesting that Jack the Ripper might have returned to continue his killing spree. These reports fueled fresh anxiety, and the city began to brace itself for the possibility that the faceless killer had resurfaced, adding another layer of terror to the already bleak atmosphere. Sergeant Edwards, who had been on duty at Tower Hill that night, reported that shortly after 2 a.m., he had noticed a man with blood-stained clothing who appeared suspicious. When questioned, the man claimed that he had been attacked, and given his disheveled state, Sergeant Edwards accepted the story and allowed him to go on his way. However, upon hearing about the murder, Sergeant Edwards grew suspicious and reported his encounter. A description of the man was quickly circulated. Despite the description, the police faced the daunting task of identifying the suspect and the victim. At the time, no one knew the identity of the woman who had been murdered. As the shocking news continued to spread, Mrs. Fleming, a woman who worked at Spitalfields Chambers, began to wonder if the victim might be Frances Coles. She decided to investigate further and, accompanied by Florence Monk, made her way to the Lemon Street police station. At the station, Mrs. Fleming was taken to the mortuary, where she was able to identify the victim as Frances Coles. She also provided the police with a detailed description of the man she had seen at the lodging house. She recalled that he wore a cheese-cutter hat, a short blue jacket, a black silk handkerchief, blue serge trousers, and lace-up boots. This description aligned with the one given by Sergeant Edwards. Mrs. Fleming went on to explain that the man had arrived at the lodging house around 3 a.m., appearing agitated. He had asked if his co had returned, claiming that he had been knocked down and kicked by a group of men near the highway. After being told that he could not stay at the lodging house, he was reluctant to leave, but eventually did, heading in the direction of the London hospital. Following this, Mrs. Fleming agreed to assist the police in tracking down the man. The next day, she joined officers as they searched the streets of Whitechapel, stopping into various beer houses. After hours of searching, Mrs. Fleming finally spotted the man in one of the pubs. The officers approached him, and after a brief exchange, he was placed under arrest. He was then taken to the Lemon Street police station for questioning. Upon his arrival, Sergeant Edwards confirmed that this was the same man he had encountered earlier in the morning on February 13th. The man identified himself as James Thomas Sadler. He admitted to knowing Frances but denied any involvement in her death. Despite his protests, the police kept James Sadler in custody while their investigations continued. Several additional witnesses came forward, stating that they had seen Sadler in the company of the young woman prior to her death. These statements further piqued the police's interest and deepened the suspicions surrounding his involvement in the crime. On the night of her death, one witness claimed that Mr. Sadler had previously lived with Miss Cole. Word quickly spread throughout the neighborhoods, with rumors circulating that the prisoner was not only responsible for the brutal murder but also the notorious Jack the Ripper. The speculation stirred up a wave of outrage, and an angry mob soon gathered outside the Lemon Street police station, demanding justice. In an attempt to protect the suspect, officers tried to lead Mr. Sadler out of a side exit, hoping to avoid the mob's fury. However, the crowd spotted him, and cries of "murderer" filled the air as the mob surged forward, determined to take matters into their own hands. In the ensuing chaos, the police were forced to defend themselves and the prisoner with their truncheons. Despite their efforts, the mob succeeded in landing several blows, leaving both police officers and Mr. Sadler battered and bloodied before order was finally restored. The following day, Sunday, February 15th, the woman found in Swallow Gardens was officially identified. Her father and sister confirmed the victim's identity as 31-year-old Frances Coles. This revelation, published in the newspapers, added a human face to the tragedy and amplified the city's growing fear and fascination with the case. On the next day, James Sadler was brought before the Thames Police Court, where he was charged with the murder of Miss Coles. Despite the immense public interest in the case, the court proceedings were closed to the public, disappointing the large crowd that had gathered outside. Mr. Sadler appeared in the dock, dressed in a blue jacket and dark trousers, his face marked with dirt and visible scratches. He sported a dark beard and mustache, and his hands were shoved into his pockets as he stood before the magistrates. Superintendent Arnold informed the court that minimal evidence would be presented in support of the request for a remand, as stated by the prosecutor, Samuel Harris. Key witness, Samuel Harris, a fish curer, testified that he had been staying at the L House in Spitalfields and knew the murdered woman. He recalled seeing her in the kitchen that night. Harris stated that Mr. Sadler had asked Miss Cole if she had any money for her bed, though he did not hear her reply. He added that Sadler had complained about being robbed, threatening to do for the person responsible. Other witnesses, Mrs. Fleming and Florence Monk, also gave testimony, and the court found sufficient evidence to charge James Sadler with the murder of Frances Coles. The case was then passed to an inquest, which was overseen by Mr. Baxter. During his testimony, Mr. Sadler's account of the night of the murder was consistent with the witnesses' statements. He admitted to being with the deceased and had openly discussed the incident at local pubs before his arrest. However, he denied any involvement in her death, claiming that on the morning of Friday, February 13th, he had gone to the London hospital at 5 a.m. to receive treatment for his injuries. Hospital staff confirmed this, and no one had seen him near Chamber Street or Swallow Gardens on Thursday night or Friday morning. The last confirmed sighting of him was at Dock Street, approximately a mile away, where he claimed to have been attacked and robbed. As he gave his testimony, observers noted his bruised face and scratched hands. The court was told that he was a married man who had been away from London for the past 17 months. Workers from the Great Northern Railway, who had seen a man with the deceased woman on Royal Mint Street at 1:30 a.m., were unable to identify James Sadler as the man they had seen. Similarly, railway foreman Joseph Napton, when asked to attend an identity parade, failed to pick out Mr. Sadler. Several police officers who had attended the scene of the crime also gave testimony, but none could positively identify James Sadler as being at the scene. However, one critical piece of evidence came from a man named Darren Campbell. Mr. Campbell testified that on Friday, February 13th, he was staying at the Sailor's Home when a man entered the establishment at around 10 a.m., claiming to be hungry and weary, having been robbed. Mr. Campbell said the man showed him a knife and asked if he would purchase it. Mr. Campbell agreed to buy the knife for $1. Afterward, the man left, and Mr. Campbell said he didn't see him again. However, when he later heard about the murder, he retrieved the knife and noticed it was not stained with blood, though the blade appeared damp. He explained that he then washed the knife in clean water, wiping it afterward. The water turned slightly discolored, which made him uneasy. The next day, short on money, he went to a shop owned by Mr. Robinson and borrowed 6 pence against the knife. He told the court that the murder kept weighing on his mind, and after speaking with some sailors, he decided to go to the police. He provided a description of the man and led them to Mr. Robinson's shop. When asked if he could identify the person, Mr. Campbell pointed directly to the defendant. Fortunately for Mr. Sadler, the Firemen's Guild had hired a competent lawyer named Harry Wilson to defend him. Mr. Wilson mounted a vigorous defense, pointing to witness testimony that supported Mr. Sadler's claim of having been attacked in the streets. The defense also presented testimony from boat captains who were familiar with the accused and vouched for his hardworking nature. Though they acknowledged his fondness for drink, they saw no signs of violence in him. Additionally, Mrs. Sarah Sadler, his wife, provided a statement about her husband's generally good character, stressing that he had always been a peaceful man. Despite these efforts, the press coverage was dominated by sensational stories, with many outlets reporting that James Sadler not only murdered Frances Coles, but was also the infamous Jack the Ripper. The idea that the elusive killer might finally be caught sparked a wave of fervent speculation. People began to hope that the truth would finally emerge. However, the media campaign became so exaggerated that even the British Interior Minister was compelled to address it in Parliament, criticizing the newspapers for fueling the public's insatiable thirst for sensationalism. On Friday, February 27, 1891, the inquest into Francis Cole's death concluded. Coroner Pter addressed the jury, noting the striking similarities between this case and previous murders, but he reminded them that it was their duty to decide if James Sadler was responsible. After much deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman stood and stated, "We find that the deceased was willfully murdered by some person or persons unknown. We wish to state that we believe the police acted appropriately in detaining Mr. Sadler." James Thomas Sadler was then released, and as he left the court, he was greeted by cheers from the gathered crowd. However, not everyone was satisfied with the verdict. At Scotland Yard, there was continued debate about Mr. Sadler's involvement in Francis Cole's murder, despite evidence suggesting the knife used in the crime was blunt and similar to the one Mr. Sadler had sold. Some, including Inspector Mville McNorton, continued to believe he was guilty. Others pointed to testimony from Sergeant Edwards and Sarah Fleming, who had seen the accused drunk in the early hours, which cast doubt on his ability to commit such a precise and brutal crime. Dr. Oxley's expert opinion further supported the argument that an intoxicated man could not have executed the controlled movements necessary to inflict the fatal wound, especially with a blunt knife. It was later reported that Frederick Dowing, who had been captured in Australia in 1892 and claimed to be Jack the Ripper, had confessed to killing Francis Coles. However, when questioned, it became clear that his version of events did not align with the facts of the crime. Dowing had been imprisoned in Hull in October 1890, meaning he was still incarcerated at the time of the murder, making his confession impossible. Speculation continued about James Sadler's possible connection to Jack the Ripper, even after he told the police that between August 17th and October 1st, 1888, when 4 of the 5 murders attributed to the Ripper had occurred, he had been absent from London. James Sadler claimed that he had been at sea during the time when the infamous Jack the Ripper murders occurred. Despite the evidence, many continued to question whether Sadler was truly responsible for the horrific crime. Officially, the murder of Miss Frances Coles, which took place in the early hours of Friday, February 13, 1891, remains unsolved. Thank you for listening. As always, feel free to leave any comments or feedback you may have. I hope to see you all again in the next case.